I never expected her to remember my name, let alone everything else. The first time I met her, it was by accident. I was lugging my suitcase down the narrow hallway of the old apartment building my friend had left me in, and she appeared from her apartment doorway, balancing a mug of tea and a stack of papers. "Alex," she said, voice soft like she was testing it on her tongue. "Is that him?" I nodded, muttering my name, and she gave that half-smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She reminded me of someone I didn't know but wanted to. A memory I'd never lived. Now, a week later, I was in the corner cafe across the street from the building, folding the napkin around my untouched scone, staring out the window at the drizzle. She appeared there sometimes, usually on weekday mornings, carrying the same faded tote bag and the same unreadable expression. I try not to look, but my eyes flicked toward her every time the door swung open. "Latte," she said when I looked up. I blinked. Yeah, thanks." She tilted her head, watching me arrange the sugar packets with that meticulous calm she seemed to carry around, and then added, almost under her breath, "You take it with 2 sugars, right?" I froze for a second, not because she remembered my order, but because she remembered. Something so small, so meaningless to anyone else, made the air between us heavier. Her hands were steady on the cup. I noticed the way she didn't fidget, didn't glance at her phone, didn't check the clock. She just existed, and I wanted to, in some small way, be noticed the same way. I told myself I was imagining it. She was just polite, friendly. But then, when I laughed at some dry comment from the barista, her lips curved slightly, and she didn't try to hide the amusement in her eyes. Not at all. I wondered if she even realized, or if she remembered my friend's face, his voice, and just got tangled in my shadow. My phone buzzed. I didn't check it. I never did when she was around. Unsure why, but felt rude, maybe sacred. A little pause, a little space that belonged to no one but me. I noticed the crease of her forehead as she sipped her tea. The way her left hand tapped lightly against the cup, like she was counting invisible things. My own hands itched to move, to do something, anything, but I just kept folding the napkin, pretending it mattered. "I have to get going," she said finally. Her voice carried that quiet gravity that made even a passing goodbye feel like something to remember. "Sure," I said. And then, "See you." She nodded once, short, hesitant, but something in that single nod lingered after she left. I watched her disappear through the cafe door, the bell tinkling behind her. I sat there a little longer, staring at the half-empty cup in front of me, thinking about how ordinary she made the morning feel and how strange that made me feel. And then my phone buzzed. I hadn't even looked. A message. From her. "I found something you left in the hallway. Can I bring it by later?" I stared at it. My fingers hovered over the screen. I had no idea if I wanted her to come or not. But the weirdest thing was that I already knew I hoped she would. When she arrived at my apartment, the package in her hand looked heavier than I expected. She paused in the doorway, shifting her weight, and for a moment neither of us spoke. "Oh, this is yours," she said, tilting the box as if testing it, though I had no idea what it contained anymore. "Yeah, I left it in the hallway last week," I said, my voice too loud in the quiet room. My fingers drummed against the edge of the table. She placed the box down carefully, hands brushing it as if it were fragile. I noticed a faint scent of lavender, her perfume, or maybe her soap, and I froze just a little. "Do you want some tea?" she asked, glancing at the kettle. "Sure," I said, though the words felt clumsy. We moved around each other in the small kitchen, her hands sliding the mugs toward us. The steam curled up between us, warm and slightly sharp, filling the room with quiet. She spoke first, almost absent-mindedly. "I always hated mornings before, before things changed." I looked at her. "Before." Her fingers tapped the rim of the mug. "Before, after David. My husband. He left the kitchen messy, always burning the toast, always forgetting the little things." She laughed softly, a dry, hollow sound. I didn't mind it so much then. I nodded, saying nothing. It felt strange, listening to someone speak about loss in a tone so even, so measured, that it barely felt like pain. And yet, somehow, I could imagine it all. The quiet house, the lost rituals the absence that clung to her. We sipped our tea, both of us silent for a moment. I noticed her glance toward the window, and then back at me, a pause so brief I could have missed it, but I didn't. I wanted to ask what it felt like, now, being here, alone with a stranger who remembered your every order, your small habits, the shape of your morning. I didn't. Instead, I imagined the possibilities, that she might see me differently, that she might notice the way I washed her hands, the way I folded the napkin like it meant something. That I might, God, I might, want more than just these small, shared silences. She caught my gaze, and for a second it lingered. Not long, but long enough to feel like a gesture. She reached out, brushing a crumb from the counter, and her hand hovered over mine just a moment too long. Just long enough that I noticed. "Thanks," she said softly. For letting me in," she said, almost laughing at herself, then turning away to refill her cup. I didn't know why that moment stayed with me. Maybe because it felt like someone finally saw me. Not the roommate, not the friend's kid, not the stranger from the street, but me. In this tiny, accidental corner of the world, sipping tea and holding back thoughts that should never have been allowed. And yet, in the quiet of that kitchen, it felt almost possible. I noticed she lingered a little longer that afternoon. Her keys jingled as she came in, a sound I'd begun to recognize, a rhythm I'd memorized. I tried not to watch, but my eyes caught the way her hair fell across her shoulder, the small shift in her weight as she adjusted the mug in her hands. "You don't have to stay," I said, even though I hadn't invited her anywhere. "I know," she replied, tilting her head. Her voice was calm, too calm. Maybe that was the part that drew me in, the steadiness, like she could hold everything, even the parts one didn't want to admit. We moved around each other in the cramped living room, her reaching for the blanket on the back of the sofa while I pretended to straighten the cushions. The air smelled faintly of tea and something else I couldn't name, warm and unsettling. I wanted to ask her something, anything, but my throat clenched. So I just folded the throw again, careful, meticulous. Then my phone buzzed. A text from my friend, "You got your landlord over again." I felt my face heat. I shoved the phone in my pocket, silently cursing the timing, the world, my luck. She noticed the flush, glanced up at me with a small, almost imperceptible frown. "You're embarrassed," she said, tilting her head. "Nothing," I muttered, but the lie tasted bitter. I couldn't explain why it mattered, why the thought of someone else knowing made the room feel smaller, heavier. She sat down across from me, knees tucked under the blanket. I noticed her hands, always so careful with where she put them. I wanted to reach out, just touch, maybe, or lean a fraction closer. But something inside me said stop. We sat like that for a long moment. The kettle boiled in the kitchen, then quiet again. Outside, someone laughed, a loud, careless sound. I imagined it echoing in her empty apartment, breaking whatever fragile rhythm we'd created. "Do you ever feel like you're supposed to be somewhere else?" she asked, voice quiet. Not looking at me, just murmuring like to herself. I nodded, though I wasn't sure if I'd been addressed. "Yeah, all the time." The air between us hummed. We were closer than before, closer than either of us would admit, but still far apart, held back by the things we didn't say. I leaned slightly, just an inch, and she shifted too, as if reading the same invisible line. My lips nearly brushed her hair, her shoulder brushed mine. A heartbeat later, and she straightened, moved to pour more tea, and the moment vanished. I could feel it in the space left behind, heavier than any words. The almost touch, the almost confession, lingered like smoke in the air. I didn't know if I wanted to chase it, or if I should leave it alone. But the fact that I even thought about it made everything else, the texts, the awkward glances, the unspoken desire, harder to ignore. And I had the sinking certainty that she felt it too. We were sitting on the bench outside the small park near my building, the late afternoon sun slipping behind the rooftops. She had her bag on her lap, fingers twisting the strap, and I realized I'd been watching her hands for the last 5 minutes without really thinking about it. "I saw your friend today," she said suddenly, voice soft. "Oh," I murmured. My stomach tightened without reason. "He asked if I told you something." She hesitated, then shook her head. "Never mind. It's silly." I wanted to press, but my voice felt stuck. Instead, I nodded, pretending to study a crack in the concrete. She glanced at me, then away. I don't know. Sometimes I feel like I shouldn't be here. Or, I shouldn't feel like this. It's ridiculous. She stopped herself, fingers clutching the strap tighter. You're so young. And I didn't move. Didn't speak. Just let her words hang in the air. I keep thinking, what if I'm crossing lines I shouldn't? She finally admitted, voice almost swallowed by the wind. She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, fingers trembling slightly. I wanted to reach for her hand. I wanted to tell her that it wasn't ridiculous, that maybe I felt the same, that maybe none of this had a rule book. But I didn't. I stayed still, letting the silence answer instead. She exhaled sharply, like she'd released something she hadn't meant to. And then, for a moment, everything shifted. Her gaze found mine. The faintest quiver in her lips, the hesitation in her eyes. I could read all of it without a word. A child's laughter echoed from the playground nearby. I turned my head, then back at her, and we both laughed quietly, awkwardly, breaking just enough tension to breathe. I don't know why I tell you these things, she said. She tucked the bag closer, leaning slightly forward, almost imperceptibly. Maybe because you listen differently, not like anyone else. I want to tell her I noticed everything. Every glance, every pause, every small, accidental closeness. But I didn't. Instead, I nodded, letting the quiet fill the space between us. The park was almost empty now. Leaves skittered along the ground. I felt a sudden surge of something. Jealousy, fear, desire, all of it tangled in a tight knot. She shifted, tucking her legs closer, and her shoulder brushed mine just slightly. My heart thumped in a way I try not to make obvious. I knew that if I moved, if I said something, it could change everything. Or nothing. Do you ever think, she started, then faltered. Stopped, eyes fixed on mine. The question hung there, unfinished, but the weight was clear. And I knew I had to answer. Or not. But before either of us could, a dog barked in the distance, a sudden intrusion into our fragile bubble. She looked away, and I realized we were both holding our breaths. I didn't know if I wanted her to speak the words, or if I wanted them left suspended in the air. The next morning, she didn't appear at the cafe. Not at her usual time, not with her tote, not with that careful tilt of her head. I waited longer than I should have, stirring my coffee until it cooled, tracing the rim of the cup with a fingertip. I try not to think, try not to replay yesterday. The bench, the words half-spoken, the air between us charged with something unnamed. But my eyes kept flicking toward the door, as if she could step in and dissolve the quiet. She didn't. And then, that evening, when I returned to the apartment, the hallway was empty, silent. No keys left in the lock. No sound of movement behind the walls. I hesitated outside her door, half expecting her to step out, to smile at me, to say something. But she didn't. Days passed. She stopped replying to my texts. The few messages I'd sent, little things, casual questions about the building, the package, remained unread, floating in limbo. I imagined all kinds of reasons. Maybe she had a visitor, maybe she was busy, maybe she just decided not to. I couldn't stop replaying our moments. The tea, the crack in the concrete, her hands twisting that strap. And I felt something I hadn't felt before, like I was suspended, waiting for permission to breathe again. Then one evening, I saw her from my window across the street. She was talking to someone, another man, older, familiar. Laughed at something he said, head thrown back slightly. And suddenly, the pieces clicked in a way I hadn't anticipated. David. Her ex. I'd seen him in photos once, a name she had mentioned quickly and brushed away. I didn't feel heartbroken. I felt paused, like life forgot to finish the sentence. I imagined going down there, knocking on her door, asking everything I shouldn't, everything I wanted, but I didn't. I lingered at the window instead, tracing her movements through the glass, feeling the tight knot in my chest loosen and tighten all at once. When I tried to write her, the messages stopped halfway. Words unsent, thoughts unfinished. Every draft I erased. My thumb hovered over the send button, then withdrew over and over. Even the apartment felt different. The quiet corner she had filled with a subtle warmth now seemed colder, emptier. Her mug still in the cabinet, her scarf draped over the chair like a ghost of her presence. I wandered the space she left behind, noticing the small details, the crease in the napkin she folded, the faint scent that lingered after she left. Each one a reminder of a tension unresolved, a connection paused. I didn't go out that night. Didn't call, didn't knock, didn't check the street. I just sat, staring at the empty seat across from me, wondering if she was thinking of me at all, or if she had already moved on in ways I couldn't imagine. The silence around me wasn't empty. It was waiting, waiting for words that would never arrive, waiting for a conversation that might never start. And I realized I was waiting too. She knocked late that night. Just once. Sharp, soft, enough to make me startle, drop the mug I'd been holding. My apartment smelled of cold coffee and lingering tea steam, shadows stretching across the floor. I opened the door. She stood there, coat half open, hair damp from the rain. She didn't smile. Not really, but there was something in the way she hesitated on the threshold, something that said she'd been thinking about this moment longer than I had. I found a book you left, she said, holding a small notebook. Thought you might want it back. I stepped aside. She entered, carefully, like she was measuring her presence, making sure she didn't overstep. I noticed how her hands didn't shake, but there was tension in her shoulders, a quiet weight I recognized immediately. We sat at the kitchen table. The notebook between us felt bigger than it was. I didn't touch it. She didn't either. Did you want to come in? I asked, voice low, almost unnecessary. She shook her head, then paused, staring at the table. I didn't know if I should. I leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on the surface. It's okay. You can. She nodded once. Just once. That small motion carried more than words ever could. The silence that followed was heavy, but not uncomfortable. It had all the history of our near moments, the small gestures, the unsent texts, the things we'd left dangling. I kept thinking about that day at the park, she said finally. Her eyes didn't meet mine. About what I almost said. About what could have happened if I hadn't stopped myself. I exhaled slowly, letting the weight of it settle. I think about it too, I admitted. My voice faltered, but I didn't correct it. I didn't hide it. More than I should. Her hand twitched slightly, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. I was scared, she admitted, of losing control, of messing things up, of being too much. You weren't, I said quietly. Not for me. Her gaze finally found mine. A small, uncertain flicker of something. Relief, maybe fear, passed across her face. The air between us shifted, tighter, quieter, but somehow safer. I reached out, just enough to let my fingers graze the back of her hand resting on the table. She didn't pull away. She didn't move closer either. But that moment, tiny, deliberate, said everything neither of us had managed to voice. Okay, she said softly. Not a surrender. Not a victory. Just acknowledgement. I nodded. Okay. We sat like that for a long time. No promises. No declarations. Just presence. Shared silence that felt like it had been building for weeks, months. A quiet human connection, enough to breathe through, enough to survive the pause, enough to notice that maybe it could go on. And in that soft, unremarkable kitchen, it did. Weeks passed. The mornings returned to their ordinary rhythm. 8:47 a.m. The hum of the heater, the smell of black coffee drifting through the apartment. She was there most days now, quietly, like she had always belonged, but without fanfare, without pretense. I learned to notice her in the small things again. The crease of her sweater at the elbow, the way her mug tilted just slightly when she poured, the subtle pause she took before speaking, as if weighing each word carefully. I noticed, and I let myself notice. We didn't speak about that night at the kitchen table or the bench or the things we'd almost said. But the air between us was lighter, warmer, like a room that had finally been aired out after a storm. Sometimes she leaned against the counter while I brewed coffee. Sometimes I found her reading quietly in the corner, legs tucked under her. And sometimes she laughed at my dry, too obvious jokes, and I caught her glance, and we didn't need to say anything. She had her routines, I had mine, and somehow they fit around each other now. I carried the small notebook she had returned, tucked between the pages of another book, as if it were a talisman. I liked knowing it was there. One afternoon, we walked past the park bench where I'd almost kissed her. The leaves were gold and brittle underfoot. She stopped, hands in pockets, and looked at it for a moment longer than necessary. "Remember this place?" I asked, almost teasing. She smirked softly, the kind of smirk that didn't need explanation. "I do," she said, letting the words hang. We didn't sit, just continued walking side by side. That bench wasn't ours anymore, not in the old way, but it had been part of the story we had quietly written together, page by page. Sometimes, in the kitchen, she would reach for a mug at the same time I did. Our fingers would brush, and we'd freeze for a heartbeat, then laugh softly and sip our tea. Or coffee. It didn't matter. The shared rhythm was enough. I still thought about how unusual it was that a friendship, a landlord-tenant relationship, had become this slow, careful kind of closeness. But it no longer felt forbidden. It felt like belonging, like a quiet claim on each other's days. She left for work one morning, scarf draped over her shoulders, and I watched her go, the door clicking shut behind her. The apartment smelled faintly of rain, of coffee, of her perfume lingering in the folds of the curtain. I poured another cup of black coffee, sat by the window, and smiled without meaning to. It wasn't a smile of triumph or relief or obsession. It was a smile that carried all the small, ordinary victories, presence, attention, warmth, shared silence. And I realized as I sipped that this quiet, patient, tentative rhythm was enough. It was ours, only ours, and that was more than I had ever expected.